I'm Benjamin Hall, and I'm searching for heroes. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me again today. And, well, look, today is a really special episode. It's frankly amazing to me because today marks the 100th episode of Searching for Heroes. And like even saying that number out loud, that feels really surreal. That's 100 weeks, 100 stories, 100 voices that have, in one way or another, reminded me, and I hope reminded you, of the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit. Now, when I started this podcast, I didn't know exactly really where it was going to go. I just know why I wanted to start it. After I was injured in Ukraine, I had to rebuild everything, body, mind, sense of who I was. And what I learned on that journey was what real resilience looks like. And not from within myself, but from the people around me, the people that led the way. And I entered into a remarkable world. And look, that has been one of the many silver linings of what happened to me. This world that I entered, the people I met, the lessons that I was taught from the doctors and nurses at the Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio where I was treated, the other wounded soldiers who stood beside me, who came to see me, and to the families I met of people who had been injured, who never gave up despite all the difficulties that they faced. And so I think that hospital, right at the beginning, that was the birthplace of this podcast. Even if I didn't realize it at the time, I remember being fascinated by the strength and the courage of the people around me. And that is where I really saw in person, not just resilience, but I learned the fact that resilience isn't rare. It's everywhere. It's in every community. It's in every family. It's in every person who decides to keep on going when so much says they shouldn't, but they do. And where they find that strength and how they do it amazes me. Now, look, coincidentally, I was back in San Antonio earlier this week. I was back visiting my doctors, back at the ICU units, the burn units. I was at the Center for the Intrepid where I learned to walk again. And it was the same week as this 100th episode. And honestly, I was thinking about it while I was there, and that feels like coming full circle. I'd been invited back to speak at a PTSD conference, a military PTSD conference, to try and help people and build up the knowledge of how to prevent PTSD in the future and how to help those who have it. And I also moderated on a panel with some of the doctors who helped save my own life. And I listened to others who are fighting right now through their own darkest days. And I looked at them and I saw myself 3 years ago. And I hoped that by hearing my story and by hearing what came next and the hurdles you can get over, that they would believe they could get there as well. Because again, what you eventually learn when you go through something difficult and traumatic, and I hope what we have learned in the 100 conversations that we have had since, is that resilience, it can be something that you're born with. I believe in that. But it's also something you can build. You train it, you nurture it, you prepare for the hard times, even when life is good. You take deep breaths before walking into something. And look, that's whether it is on a battlefield or if it's in a boardroom, or if it's just a hard and tough conversation with someone that you love. You remind yourself, I can get through this. And look, when you can't do it alone, that's when you lean on others. Because the one thing that every single doctor has told me, and again, this is something that I've seen in every story we've told on this podcast, is that the people who recover best are the ones surrounded by family, by community, by people who fight with them, for them. That's what this podcast has also been about the power of community. And so over these 100 episodes, I've met people who have faced the very worst, and they've gone and turned it into something better. I've spoken to survivors, to heroes, to those who would never call themselves that, but I think they are. And a few of the ones that stand out, they all stand out, to be honest. But, we heard the very first guest we had was Rich Fierro. He was a dad, he was an army vet, and he ran towards gunfire in a nightclub to save countless lives. And we talked about fight or flight, what that meant to him. We spoke to Maya Regev, who returned from Hamas captivity in those tunnels. And today she is thriving. We heard from Amanda Boxtel, who learned to stand again and walk when doctors said she couldn't. From Aaron Ralston, from 127 Hours, who kept climbing after he had to cut his hand off to survive many years ago. Steve Callahan, he survived 76 days at sea. Astronaut Scott Kelly, he spent a year in space. Sam Goodwin, he came back from a Syrian prison cell, horrible conditions, but with steadiness. And then we heard more recently from Azim Khamisa. He chose forgiveness over fury, and he forgave the person who killed his son. So the list goes on. And as I've been thinking this week about this episode, I am just really proud of it, but I'm also amazed at the human spirit in all of them. So many lives, so many stories. What a great honor it has been for me. And, I hold this podcast up perhaps as the most important thing I currently do, and one that gives me the most reward. And I think of the countless doctors, parents, soldiers, adventurers, everyday people who come to share their stories with us. And each one of them has taught me something new about strength. Not always the kind that shouts out, sometimes the kind that endures it quietly. And, they've taught me something else. I think that, and I feel this personally, that resilience isn't about pretending everything's fine. Resilience doesn't mean that you are totally strong and 100%. No, resilience is about accepting that things have changed in life and then adapting to that reality. And then what might be the hardest step of all, embracing that reality. So it's accept, adapt, embrace. Those are the 3 steps that saved my life. And they're the 3 I wrote about in my last book, Resolute. And I've seen them repeated in one form or another in almost every guest we've had.
I'm Benjamin Hall, and you're listening to Searching for Heroes.
I've also learned that resilience doesn't always involve action and great action. It is sometimes just sitting still. It's forgiveness. Perhaps it's a quiet decision made in the dark, or sometimes it's falling and deciding that you'll just try again tomorrow. And it's those little acts, those small moments that make the biggest difference. We see it every single day as we walk around. It's the stranger who smiles at you in the street. It's a friend who calls up, a veteran who reaches back to help the next one up. Or it's the parent who simply refuses to give up. These are the building blocks of resilience and also of community. There's a very recent experience which I will remember forever, happened just in Texas early this week, where my doctor, the man who patched me up, who brought me back to the world, Dr. Alderetti, he took me up to a mountain. And out of nowhere, he basically says, we're going mountain biking right through the hills of Texas. And this was the first time that I'd ridden a bike, let alone up a mountain. And at the end of the day, scratched, bruised, bleeding in some places after falling off into cacti and rocks, I realized something, that I was no longer being held back by my injuries. The scars that once symbolized what I had lost had become proof of what I had gained. And I want everyone listening to know. And this is a message that so many of our guests say as well, that your scratches, your scars, your past, none of it has to hold you back. They can be the very things that propel you forward. This podcast has taught me also that we are capable of more than we think, far, far more. That resilience is in everyone. And sometimes it just takes hearing someone else say, I've been there and I've made it through, to encourage you. So look, today on this 100th episode, first of all, I want to say thank you. Thank you to each and every one of you who've listened, who've written, who've shared your own stories, who've reminded me why we do this. And of course, I want to thank my incredible team. Thank you so much. There are so many tech engineers. There are so many people sitting in New York who are doing the really difficult work. So I couldn't do it without them. They make every single week possible. And that's when I'm in a different time zone. I'm in the middle of nowhere. They're there for me around the clock. So thank you to them. And I want to say also that Searching for Heroes is not done, not even close. because there are so many more stories to tell. We've talked about solitude, forgiveness, rebirth, and we're going to keep going. We're going to talk about courage, about faith, about redemption, about hope. We're going to keep searching for the light in some of the darkest places, for the people who remind us that strength is contagious, because we mustn't turn away from the dark places. We must understand them. We must look them straight up. And that's how we get through them. And I hope for all of you listening at home that every time you listen, you take something away. Something small, I hope. Something, though, that stays with you. Maybe it's a quote, a story, I don't know. But that, I think, is why I really want to do this and why I hope to keep it going. And because I think that's what I've learned from these 100 episodes. It's, resilience in general is not a destination. It's not somewhere we just want to get to. It is a constant way of living. It's something you practice every day. You practice it by showing up, by being kind, by refusing to quit. So again, to everyone out there listening, thank you. Thank you for being part of this journey. Thank you so much to Fox for letting me do this. And thank you, everyone, for helping me keeping Searching for Heroes going. Because they're out there. These stories are everywhere, in every home, in every hospital, in every family. Maybe even right where you're sitting now. Here's to the next 100. I'll speak to you next week.
Thanks for listening to Searching for Heroes. Listen ad-free with a Fox News Podcasts Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts. And Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.